Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in. The title of this talk is Fictional Expectations and the Ontology of Power. We have little difficulty in our everyday interactions to identify who has power and who doesn't. But in the literature of power, there are deep disagreements about the ontology of power, right? What kind of thing power is and how it fits into our understanding of the social world. In my talk, I want to explore the role that fictional expectations play in constituting power. And so I'm going to approach questions about the ontology of power by exploring the pragmatic character of power ascriptions. So in other words, what is it that we're doing when we ascribe power to someone? I'm going to argue that power ascriptions involve fictional expectations directed at an open future. So when we take an agent to be powerful, we act as if that agent had a robust capacity to make a difference to the actions of others. While social reality, whose future is open, can never fully live up to this expectation, acting on it nonetheless helps constitute power. I'm going to suggest kind of at the end of the paper, and only somewhat briefly, that this account can help us reconcile the disagreement between consensual and conflictual accounts of power. And there's an additional 5-minute video where I talk a little bit about the difference between those two accounts of power and how they capture different kind of aspects of how we experience power. So I think that this account can reconcile some of the differences between these different kind of families of accounts by recognizing the performative role that representations of power play in creating and maintaining power. I should emphasize at the outset that even though this paper has fiction in the title, it's not an anti-realist account of power. So I'm not in any way claiming that power does in some way not really exist, or that it is a kind of mere illusion when people experience power. So power is very real, and the question that my talk is concerned with is how we best understand its way of being. So the talk is going to have two parts. In the first 10 minutes, I'm going to discuss the role that fictional expectations play in the constitution of money, in part because in the discussion of money, I think this idea is much more familiar. And then in the second part, I'm going to try to apply what we can learn from money to power, or if you think that money is a form of power, to other forms of power. All right. So economic sociologists such as Jeffrey Ingham and John Beckert have pointed out that our use of money involves fictional expectations. So Jeffrey Ingham, for example, speaks of a working fiction of an invariant monetary standard. The idea here is that money can only function as a medium of exchange and as a store of value if we can expect that it will retain its value. Right? This assumption is necessary, for example, to coordinate supply and demand in large-scale and personal markets. It's also required for long-term debt contracts, right? Because it gives lenders the confidence that their interest will not be eroded by inflation. So since modern credit money is created through the creation of private and public debt, its use is based on the assumption that debts will be repaid in the future, which in turn is based on expectations of future economic performance. So accepting money in exchange or using it as a store of value requires imagining that a particular kind of future will come to be. Now, this assumption of a stable monetary future relies on an idealization. Right? It disregards possible futures in which money loses its value. Right? So, in fact, the monetary future is open. Right? Even reasonable confidence in the stability of money can be disappointed in unexpected financial crises. Maintaining money's value requires the continuous efforts of, say, central banks, governments, as well as many other actors, and these efforts can fail. And yet, to use money intelligibly, we have to disregard this possibility. Right? As John Beckert puts it, to create belief in the stability of money, its future value must be successfully feigned. Now, by calling this an idealization, I don't mean to suggest that it is necessarily false or unjustified. Idealized expectations of money, about money, often become true because they have a constitutive effect. So a stable monetary future comes about if and because enough agents act on the expectation that money's value will be stable. Right? So to simplify a very complex story, if enough people are convinced that the value of money is stable, they're more likely to engage in the kinds of economic interactions that will, in fact, keep the value of money stable. Now, to explain why I characterize these expectations as fictional, I want to draw on an insight by Joseph Rouse that he developed in the context of discussing the role of idealizations in science. So Rouse points out that even literary fictions do not simply serve as representations of non-existent situations or entities. Right? So consider, for example, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The point of this novel is not simply to represent some kind of non-existing situation or non-existing persons. Rather, by focusing on 3 or 4 families in a country village, Austen's novel creates a controlled setting in which the complex consequences of a few selected features and character traits and their relations can be elaborated. Right? And since the story draws on, plays with, and is ultimately accountable to the material and discursive setting in which the reader is situated, right, it can help readers to understand themselves in new and surprising ways. Right? So the central function of this literary fiction is not representational, but articulative. So when we turn to money, we realize that the purpose of a working fiction of an invariant monetary standard is also not primarily to represent some kind of non-existing fact. Rather, its point is to articulate complex, new ways in which social agents can relate their present and future actions to one another. Right? So ways for them to relate their actions that wouldn't be possible without this fiction. Money is an abstract and transferable claim, right? So it abstracts both from the concrete material features of the goods and services for which it can be exchanged, and from the idiosyncrasies of particular debtor-creditor relations. And it's this abstraction that makes it possible to use money to plan for the future despite of uncertainty of what I and others will need, want, and are going to do in the future. Right? And this allows us to engage in complex multilateral exchanges and to enter long-term anonymous debt relations. So the use of money is premised upon, to summarize, the use of money is premised upon an ontology of an intrinsically stable monetary value. Social reality can never fully live up to this ontology, since in practice the value of money is always precarious. And yet this idealization has a kind of performative function. It brings about the social structures that are necessary to constitute monetary value. All right, so with that, I want to turn to power. Right? So the idea that fiction plays a role in constituting money, in some sense or other, might be a familiar kind of idea, but this idea seems less plausible in the case of power. And so I now want to show how this idea can be applied to the case of power. So when we confront power in everyday social interactions, we usually experience it as a kind of robust social force that's independent of us, that's outside of our control, and which can negatively affect us or negatively shape our options in ways, right, that are detrimental to us. And it's this experience of power that's the starting point for a broad family of so-called conflictual theories of power. Right? These are theories who conceive power that conceive power as a robust ability to prevail in social conflict. Right, so in the literature of power, these are sometimes contrasted with consensual theories of power, which take as their starting point the idea that power is ultimately based on cooperation of some sort. So one question that this kind of contrast between these two families of theories raises is how power could be both, right? It seems like there are some good reason to think that power is both constituted through some kind of cooperation and is a robust capacity that can be used to prevail in conflict. And yet those two seem to be in tension. So it will help us better assess this tension, I will argue, that if we realize that even everyday ascriptions of power involve fictional expectations. And so that's what I'm going to argue now. So to make this argument, I'm just going to go through a kind of simple case. Suppose a police officer stops me and demands identification, right? I might comply without thinking, right? Or maybe I comply in light of the potential consequences of disobedience, right? Bodily harm, arrest, being convicted of a crime, as a result of which I might lose my job or my freedom, my social standing, my ability to vote, etc. So I judge in the moment that I'm unlikely to avoid all these consequences because the officer has power, right? That is a robust ability to bring about these consequences, even in the face of my resistance or the resistance of others. So my compliance in this case is based on ascribing to the officer a robust social capacity, right? And this ascription seems to have the character of a kind of description of a social fact, right? I mean, that the officer has power. But on reflection, I think this is at best only part of the story. So first, I think we need to point out that the consequence of non-compliance in this case, that the consequences of non-compliance that I fear, right, don't obtain automatically, right? They have to be actively implemented by other agents whose actions have to be appropriately aligned with those of the police officer, right? So suppose, for example, I refuse to follow the officer's order, hoping to challenge it in court, right? So the officer's power depends in part on the judge, as well as many other agents, right, to kind of confirm, support, and implement the actions and decisions of the police officer. So to use a term coined by Thomas Wartenberg, power is based on social alignments. An agent can effectively exercise power only to the extent that the actions of other agents appropriately align with hers. Now, it's possible, even if it's relatively unlikely, that these agents fail to align their actions, right? So social alignments are not static things, right? But rather they're based on ongoing social relationships that need to be continuously reproduced, right? And their reproduction depends on a myriad of factors that in the situation, I'm not able to all know, right? And in that sense, the future of the alignment is uncertain or open. And sometimes its reproduction may fail, right? Sometimes even very powerful regimes collapse more or less overnight because they appear weak, say, and as a result lose the necessary social support. But in the moment, as I experience the officer as powerful, I disregard these possible futures, right? And in this sense, power ascriptions involve some kind of idealized expectations. Now, as in the case of money, we can see that acting on these idealized expectations has a constitutive effect. So let me just kind of make this kind of point in two ways. First, right, suppose I refuse to comply with the order, thereby effectively challenging the officers and the police, right, more general, the police's projection of power, right? Right, if the police fails to answer this challenge, this can give other people reason to engage in a similar challenge. So in order to maintain their power, they will have to kind of actively respond to reassert this kind of projection of power. Right? And what this illustrates, I think, is that power depends on the disposition of many agents to treat the powerful as powerful. Secondly, if I do comply, what I'm doing is I'm in effect adding myself to the social alignment that helps constitute the police's power. Right? It's obviously just a very small addition, but nonetheless, right, I kind of help reconstitute a social alignment that gives the police power. Right, so by doing what I'm told, I'm, as it were, acting in concert with the officer. Moreover, right, it's not just my contribution, it's also that I'm allowing her to achieve her goal without having to mobilize other agents, right? So she kind of gets my contribution for free. And in addition to that, my compliance can serve as evidence for others of the police's power, right? And so it might give others kind of reason to comply as well. So the ascription of power that's implicit in my compliance is more than simply an observation, right? Rather, it has a kind of performative character. It helps to bring about a certain social reality. To further understand how this works, I think it's useful to think of power as involving a form of credit, right? So picking up on our comparison to money a little bit. Ascribing power to the officer involves expectations about her future ability to bring about certain consequences. So if I comply with her order, her actions, right, her action has an effect, her action of demanding the ID has an effect on me without her having to cash in those expectations, right? That is, without having to satisfy them. And in turn, my compliance will actually bolster her credit with others, right? Because my compliance communicates the continued stability of her ability. And she can continue to draw on this credit in her interactions with others without having to prove in each case that this credit is ultimately backed, right? So in some sense, the kind of expectation that the expectation will be fulfilled is kind of constantly deferred. Of course, when her exercise of power is challenged, she'll have to cash in some way. That is, she'll actually have to draw on the support of aligned agents. Right? But the more complex the underlying social alignments are, the more stable and unchallengeable power can appear, since individual challenges are kind of diffused more easily. So conceiving of power in this way, in terms of credit, I think emphasizes the dynamic and future-oriented character of power. Let me just see if So power ascriptions are different from ordinary capacity ascriptions to material objects. Right? So material things have causal capacities in virtue of a determinate internal structure. Right? In contrast, power ascriptions are vindicated only in a future that's yet to be shaped. So whether the officer will be successful in imposing a particular social consequence on me depends on the successful reproduction of her relationships with other agents. So a social alignment is not like a machine that's just waiting to be turned on to crank out some effect, or like a material resource that's ready to be picked up and put to use. Social alignments only exist insofar as they are continuously reconstituted by the ongoing activities of the aligned agents, and in light of what other agents will do in the future. Ascriptions of power are thus premised upon an ontology of a robust, stable capacity, an ontology that social reality can never fully live up to. And yet, it's not simply a mistake when we imagine power as a static feature. For example, right, when we imagine it in analogy to physical strength, or a mechanism, or a material resource. In order to act meaningfully in a complex social world with an open future, I have to act on the assumption that there are relatively stable structures that make the effects of actions, both of my action, of the actions of others, predictable. Right? This insight into the kind of constitutive effects of misrepresenting power as a robust static capacity helps us reconcile the insights of consensual theories of power, right? The idea that power is based on some kind of social preparation, with the experience that conflictual theories are based on, namely the experience of power as a robust capacity that can be used to prevail in conflict, right? Rather than understanding this kind of basic idea as a kind of description of social reality, what we should do is focus on its performative effect, right? So thinking of power as a robust static feature is a kind of necessary way of imagining power that brings about, that helps constitute power, even though, but it's not a kind of good description, because social reality can never fully live up to the kind of ontology that's implicit in that image. All right, so in that sense, power is based on fictional, in that sense, kind of power is in part constituted by fictional expectations. All right, well, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions, comments, criticisms, etc.